and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. Those are the words of a prayer poured out by an ancient woman named Hannah. Many of you will know her story. Barren and bitter, then praying and pregnant, then giving birth, and then giving that son to God. And that son would grow up to be the famous Herculean prophet of the Old Testament, Samuel. And as a weaned little guy, she brought him to the temple, and in an act of devoting him to God, left him there, that his life might be utterly dedicated to God. After her sacrifices, she prayed, and wow, did this woman pray. Follow along in chapter 2 with me. Then Hannah prayed and said, "Oh, my heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly or let your mouth speak such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry hunger no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. Upon them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked will be silenced in darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." End quote. You almost wonder, is she praying or preaching? That's a sermon right there in itself. Go, woman, go. Wow. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and he raises up. He humbles and he exalts. What Hannah so beautifully described in her prayers, what theologians call the sovereignty of God. She acknowledged that all things are under the exalted control of the Creator. Whether by his direct command or by his permission, nothing in this universe comes to pass that he has not either decreed or has allowed. And this is important because we are not riding on some out-of-control rock spinning aimlessly and randomly through the universe. A universe that lacks order or system or guidance or supervision. Humanity as a whole, nor in our own personal lives, bump about randomly on this rock that we call Earth. And the reason that they don't is because there is a God who is self-existent, who is eternal, who is infinite, who is transcendent, who is triune, who is holy, who is just, who is faithful, who is loving, who is merciful, who is wise, and today is sovereign. And when we say that God is sovereign, we need to point out that he is singular in his sovereignty, which means that there is no co-sovereign with him. He is utterly and absolutely unique from all others. There is no other uncreated being. All are created by this uncreated being, and he therefore is sovereign himself. Did you see what Hannah said in verse 2? Look at verse 2 again. There is no one. There is no one. Now the atheist would have you stop there and say, that's right, there's no one. It's just us. But no, the Word of God says, God himself speaks and says, there is no one like the Lord. He and he alone is sovereign. 1 Chronicles declared it in verse 11 when I read at the beginning of the service. You are exalted as head over all. There's no co-head. There's no like council of heads, right? There's no multiple gods that convene together to determine the affairs in heaven and on earth. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 39, the Lord speaking to Israel says, the Lord is God in heaven above and on the earth below. There is no other. He is singular. There is a question that when asked to God is itself an act of worship. See if you recognize it. Let me say that again. There's a question that when you ask it can be asked as a form of worship. See if you recognize it. Who is like you, O Lord Most High? Right? That person is not inquiring if there is in fact someone else in the universe that is like God. That person is declaring that God is utterly unique through a question. And God does the same thing. He'll ask the same question, and he's not asking for information when he asks the question. He's making a point. He'll say like he does in Isaiah 40:25. To whom will you compare me, Justin? Just exactly who do you think is my equal? He's not looking for an answer because he's making the point. He's giving me an answer. Nobody's my equal. Nobody compares to me. I love when Moses, after the Egyptian army and Pharaoh were washed away by the Red Sea, and the Israelites are standing there, mouths gaping, looking at everything that just happened. Moses, what does he do? This is why we sing in church. Moses writes a song. He writes a song, and this is what he says in Exodus chapter 15, verse 11. Who is like you? Right? None of the gods of Egypt could save Pharaoh and the Egyptian army against the hand of the Lord, because he singularly is sovereign over the universe that he has created. No angel, no man, no beast, nothing. He and he alone reigns and rules. He has sovereign possession. His sovereignty means that he possesses all things. It's an awesome thought to think about this. Everything he created belongs to him. If you're in 1 Samuel, go back to Deuteronomy chapter 10. Just a couple books backwards to your left. Deuteronomy chapter 10. Absolutely everything that is not God, God owns. It's his. By virtue of being the creator, he owns absolutely everything. Deuteronomy 10, verse 14. To the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it. Everything in it. For every living soul belongs to me, God says in Ezekiel 18:4. Your soul is the possession of God. It is his. My soul belongs to him. The soul of every living creature is God's. For every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills belong to God. Why? They may belong to so-and-so, and 100 of them may belong to him, and maybe 300 belong to the next guy down the road, but they only belong to them temporarily. It all ultimately belongs to God. This building belongs to Emmanuel Free Church right here at 17737 West Spring Lake Road, but this building ultimately belongs to God. The trees in the neighbor's yard, they may be his and he may pay taxes on them, but they do not belong to him ultimately. They belong ultimately to God, because this spinning rock careening around in the universe is God's, and everything in it. And not only everything on it, but everything in the whole universe and everything in the heavens that our eyes cannot behold belong to him. It is all his sovereign possession. For by you all things were created, and by your will you created them, and they have their being. Revelation 4:11. God in his sovereignty, it also means that he has all authority. Not only is God singular in his sovereignty, not only does he possess all things and own all things in his sovereignty, but brothers and sisters, he has the absolute, undisputed, highest authority in all of existence. Jesus said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." My Father, Jesus said, is greater than all. Do you remember Colossians chapter 1? Flip from Deuteronomy all the way to the New Testament and go to Colossians chapter 1. To get there, you'll pass Ephesians, you'll pass Philippians, and then after Philippians, you'll get to Colossians. If you hit the Thessalonian books, you've gone too far. If you hit the index, the concordance, you've gone way too far. In Colossians chapter 1, this glorious, the whole chapter is amazing. It is utterly worth the time to spend memorizing. The whole book of Colossians actually is worth memorizing. Verse 15. He, that is Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him, that is Christ, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He has absolute control over all things. He has absolute authority over all things. Jesus says, "My Father is greater than I." All other authority is beneath Jesus's, and all other authority is answerable to him. Think about that. Think about that. We talk about the different spheres, right? The church, civil government, family, and so forth. Everyone who possesses authority derives that authority for their position and their location in society or in the church or in the home. They have that authority as a derivative from God and are accountable to God ultimately someday for the way that authority was exercised. God also has sovereign control. He has authority and he is in control of all things. Nothing is out of his control. This will be the greatest comfort and release for you to come to this conclusion in your heart and to make it from here to here, that God is in control. Turn with me, if you will, to Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. Go back into the Old Testament. If you find the book of Ezekiel, it's a big book. It's the book right after Ezekiel. In Daniel chapter 4, he says in verse 35, actually this is Nebuchadnezzar, after he got his sanity back, his 7 years of wandering the forest like a beast on all fours, eating grass, that's all over with. He gets his sanity back, and the first thing he does is he worships God. And look at how he acknowledges the sovereign control of God above. Verse 35, all the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand, and no one can say to him, "What have you done?" Or as Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 39 says, "See now that I myself am he, declares the Lord. There is no God beside me. I put to death, I bring to life, I wound, I heal, and no one can deliver out of my hand." He is utterly free in this sense as the sovereign Lord. He is obligated to no one and nothing. Job chapter 41, verse 11, God asks, "Who has a claim against me that I have to repay? Who can come against me and say, 'You owe me this'? When everything that I have and am has been given to me by him, and I owe everything to him. He owes me nothing. If God is obligated to anyone for anything, it really is that God is obligated to himself. In other words, God is faithful, and so God will be faithful because that's what he is. And to be faithful and to be just and to be right means that he will bring what is right into my life. Ultimately, not for me, although I benefit from that, but because he is a just and he is a righteous God, and he will express that in this universe. And it may not be today, but it will be. It will be in his time. That God is sovereign means that he's the one who has the rights to do what he pleases with what he has made. Everything is what it is, where it is, and when it is, because that is what God determined. Do you remember what Acts 17 says? Acts 17 shows that God is sovereign in our own very lives. Why are you not born in 500 BC in the Middle East? Why are you not born right now in a third world country? Why are you not born right now in a Muslim nation? Why are you not born in North Korea right now? Why are you not born a Jew taken on cattle cars to the concentration camps last century? Why were you not born during the Civil War? Why were you not born a slave in the early days of America? Why were you not born before that in any time in history, anywhere around the world? Why were you not born then, that person? Acts chapter 17 tells us. Acts chapter 17 says God is sovereign. And it says that God determined the times set for every man. That's every individual man and woman. The time was set for you to be born, and he set the exact places where they should live. Utterly out of our control, but utterly under the control of God, that we would be born where we are, when we are, because God is sovereign. And he has determined that. Everything has the freedoms and the limits that he sets, and what happens and doesn't happen is ultimately set by his will. And God will be worshiped as a sovereign. His sovereignty means that he is owed all majesty, all glory, and all honor. And I said owed, and the Bible makes that clear because it is an obligation to God from his creatures. Think about that. What we do here, it's not optional, it's obligatory. Do you realize that? That because of who God is, because of what he is to us, it is not an option to worship him. It is actually a requirement to worship him. He is owed it. It's an injustice to God to deny him worship. And it is the fulfillment, you might say, of justice to bring him worship. It is only from a heart that knows that he is utterly worth everything. Nothing breathes or moves, lives or dies, prospers or suffers, flourishes or withers apart from his sovereignty. And one of the greatest liberating realizations in the Christian life is that God is sovereign. It liberates me from the slavish thought that I am in control, or the slavish attempt to be in control. Because nobody who has control issues, and we all have control issues, we all want to be in control in one way or another, or in multiple ways, to varying degrees or another, but we all want control because we all are deluded in thinking somehow that if I feel that I am in control of something, I will have the peace that I am seeking. But the sovereignty of God, when I shift my eyes to him and see that he is in control, it is utterly liberating. Because who's more righteous? Who's more just? Who's more wise? Who's more powerful? Who's more righteous and holy? Who's more faithful? Certainly not me between us two. If it's between me and God, I want God to be the one who's in absolute control. I want God to be the one who's in absolute control. And it's best that he is. It's interesting because if you go through a concordance, in studying this past week, one of the things I was doing was just kind of going through the concordance and looking up sovereign and sovereignty. And one of the things that really stood out to me was the vast majority of the occurrences of the word sovereignty happened when God was addressing Israel and he was identifying himself. Like, here's my point, that when God speaks, there's a connection between God speaking and his sovereignty. Like, thus saith the sovereign Lord, or the sovereign Lord says, and he says to the prophets, go tell them that the sovereign Lord says. He wanted them to hear from the prophet that the Lord, and not just the Lord, but the sovereign Lord is the one who has a message for you. And so this sovereign God speaks. And what is the point of this? Why is it that all the occurrences, or so much, 90+% of the occurrences of the word sovereign were related to God and his speaking? And the only thing I can come up with is the fact that God is expressing through his speaking the command and the authority that he has over his creatures. Through who he is as the sovereign Lord, in speaking and communicating with his creatures, who would thus respond in obedience to him. It was his speaking to them, whereby he would lay out his authority over them and their obligation to fulfill those commands. God is a speaking God, and as a speaking God, he expresses and shows forth his sovereignty. What did he do? When he was sovereign over creation at the beginning, did he just sort of nod his head and then light came forth? Did he just sort of flinch towards the land and then vegetation would sprout? Do you remember what it says? It says that he spoke. And under his sovereign power and control and authority, the creation obeyed and it grew and it came to be. Do you remember when they were in the boat with Jesus? You remember the picture that Rembrandt painted? Where they're all just in absolute terror over the winds and the storm and the raging sea and all of that. And you can just imagine the disciples, like, there's one puking over the side. There's others who are just like, in a fetal position. There are others like crying out, to heaven. And then there's Jesus sleeping in the boat, right? Jesus didn't have one hesitation about who was in control, the storm or God. He knew who was in control, and it wasn't the storm. But he showed his sovereignty when he stood up and he spoke to the sea and the storm, and it ceased. It obeyed. He spoke to the demons, and they left their victims. He spoke to the diseased, and they were healed. He spoke to people, and they believed. He spoke to people, and they didn't believe. Okay? He is the sovereign God, and through his speaking showed forth his sovereignty. God's sovereignty and human serenity. Coming to grips with God's sovereignty means letting go of my grip on being in control. And there is a peace and a serenity that comes with trusting God as sovereign that far surpasses any peace that I might get from thinking that I'm in control. We are either wrestling to get control of people or circumstances, or we are scared that we are going to lose control. But the scope of peace is far more vast for us when we resign our effort to control and instead we look up to the one who is truly in control. God's sovereignty means we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be afraid. I might die. You're gonna die. You're gonna die. But not randomly. Ultimately not accidentally. The one who knows every hair on your head, the one who formed you in your mother's womb, and in that same passage says that ordained for you all of your days, the one who knows your last breath and when it will be here. You may know none of these things, and you may not have had a hand in any of these things, but he had a hand in it, and he knows all of it, and it's all by his sovereign determination. Not only to determine when you will live, not only to determine where you will live, but he knows and has set for you the days that you will live, the number of them. Some of them may be shorter than others. The days that others live, others may be longer. Some people may live longer, some people may live shorter. It's all under God's sovereign control. It's all under his sovereign control, but we don't have to be afraid. Not when we know that he is in control. God's sovereignty and human submission is another thought here. God's sovereignty and human submission. Maybe an odd place to start with this point is in James. Well, I guess reading James, maybe not. That's the guy who's full of commands and rebukes. So why don't we get to James 5 and watch him turn on the heat. James chapter 5. And in James 5, hold on one second. I think I got the wrong verses written down. You're like, man, hey, if you're visiting, give me another chance. Chapter 4, not 5. Jeez. Man. All right, I'll turn in that grace credit right now from you guys. Chapter 4, verse 13. James says, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city. We'll spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast and brag, and all such boasting is evil." All such boasting is evil. Do you see how James saw all human activity that was happening underneath the tent of God's sovereignty? That nothing happened unless the Lord willed it, and he either permitted it or he was making it happen, so to speak. We ought to make plans for tomorrow. By all means, don't give up your retirement accounts, and we ought to plan for, we do not throw our calendars away and our planners away. I know that'd be almost for you, babe. Okay? We ought not to do that. But we ought to remember that whatever we plan and whatever it is that we look to tomorrow or the days or the years ahead for, we make our plans and we always put the asterisk on our plans that says, if the Lord wills. If the Lord wills. That's why I love, it's something small, but it's just so, it's so good and it's so conditioning when people will email or text me or something and they'll say things like, "I'll see you Sunday, Lord willing." Yeah, I got that from you this past week, right? I get that from a number of you, and there's just that constant reminder of nothing is happening. Sunday's not a guarantee. Sunday's not a guarantee every week. Listen, we don't know if we're going to be here next Sunday. Okay? I don't know what your eschatology is. Mine is that we could possibly be gone by next week. Okay? But here's what we do know. We're a week closer this week than we were last week. Yeah, got you with that one, didn't I? Some of you haven't heard that. Some of you haven't heard that. I haven't been saying it enough. That's kind of like our slogan around here. Think about it. You are literally 1 week closer. You could say you're 1 week closer to your death. You're 1 week closer to this or to that. You're 1 week closer to retirement. You're 1 week closer to, maybe you're engaged. You're like, I'm 1 week closer to getting married. Whatever. I'm 1 week closer to my baby being born. Whatever it is. But you're also 1 week closer to the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. Live with that thought. Live with that thought. He's coming. If he permits, my plans will succeed. If not, they won't. And his will is good. His will is good. James is admonishing his readers to live with a, quote, God is sovereign consciousness. That means living each day fully aware that God is in control of the world that I live in, and he is in control of my own personal world. And the sovereignty of God also means moral submission to God. I live out the moral commands that God has given me because God is the highest authority. I'm not. Let none of us live with the notion that somehow what I decide for myself is right and wrong, but every one of us decide that we will follow what God has instructed and what God has prescribed and what God has taught us. That point needs to sink in, I think, especially if you're younger. If you're younger, okay, especially, you really need to ask yourself the question, if you're out there today, you need to ask yourself the question, what is it that's going to be your lodestar? What is it that's going to be your north? What's going to be your compass that directs you towards, no, I will think this way and I won't think that way. I will believe this and I won't believe that. This will be morally right and this will be morally wrong. What is it that's going to determine that for you? Is it going to be the constant shifting of culture and society? Is it going to be social media? Is it going to be the mainstream media? Is it going to be politicians? Is it going to be your friends? What is it that for you is going to be, this is where I put my feet down and this is where I will stand. This is what will be for me my rock. What is that for you? Do you want the approval of people or do you want the approval of God? At the end of the day, at the end of your life, whose approval matters? That's where your faith is really going to be seen for what it is. If this is just playtime, if this is just like, hey, I'm here because my mom and my dad make me come here, okay? Fine, you go through stages like that, we can understand that. But I'm going to speak to young guys and girls here. Understand, you got to make a decision, and nobody guarantees that you're going to live to see 19, 20, 21, 22, 30. No one guarantees you that. So you got to make up for your mind. You got to make up for yourself. Who will you stand with? Who will you stand on? And what will you stand for? Because so many of your peers have literally just walked away from the Christian faith and said, what the world says is right. What the world says is this or that. That's what matters and that's what I'll follow. And you have to make up your mind if you want the approval of them or you want the approval of God. And it's going to be, I'm telling you, it's not going to be easy. But you got to make up your mind on that. Nobody's going to tell you that this is going to be easy and everything's going to be fun and everything. But I'll tell you, there will be no greater joy in Christ. There's no sweeter joy. There's no greater love. There's no greater meaning to your life than to know that your life means something for Christ and that He is the one who is your meaning. He's your sovereign, not your peers. He's your sovereign. Make Him your sovereign. Well, that was a sermon sort of within a sermon. I'm glad you guys are here today, some of you. I mean, we got a couple of you. So God is sovereign. Is God sovereign in suffering? Is God sovereign in hurricanes and earthquakes? Is He sovereign in Afghanistan? Is He sovereign during elections? Is He sovereign at my doctor appointment? Is He sovereign at a funeral? Is He sovereign in the possibility that I might die from COVID? Is God sovereign? How is God sovereign when my kids turn away from Him? Or when a loved one suddenly and unexpectedly dies, or when I miscarry, or when I lose my job? How is God sovereign? Upon the news that his 10 children were killed by some freak accident, and that he had lost all his wealth and possessions, Job ripped his clothes, shaved his head bald, and he collapsed to the ground. And the very first words coming out of his trembling lips that he uttered were these: Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. I had nothing coming into this world, and I will leave with nothing. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. You can see the sovereignty of God and the perspective that Job had. But then he followed with perhaps what I think are the most profound words that can be uttered in the midst of suffering. May the name of the Lord be praised. The book of Job sets forth the sovereignty of God over human suffering as clearly as any place in the Scriptures. Nothing that can harm could come to Job without permission from God himself. Chapter 2, verse 6 in the book of Job records God's words to Satan when he says, quote, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." Notice that God was not helpless to keep Job from the hands of Satan, but Satan needed the permission of the sovereign God before he could do anything to Job. It reminds us of what Jesus said to Peter when he said, Peter, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. And then in brackets you can say he's received permission. And Jesus goes on to say, but when you've stumbled, come back, and you've come back, remember to strengthen your brothers. Permission had been given for Satan to attack Peter. God allows, he permits, he lets suffering and evil happen, and it only happens by his sovereign decision to allow it. But how can God be good and all-powerful and allow evil and suffering to happen? Let me just say this first of all. You need to ask that question. It's a legitimate question to ask. Remember, you can ask questions in two ways. Human beings can ask questions about God in two ways. One, they can be asked as scoffing attacks on God from a skeptical spirit and heart. Or someone can ask the question honestly, like Job asked the questions. Where is my maker? If I could but just address him on this matter, where are you, God? Why has this happened? There's legitimate ways to ask questions, and we need to ask the question. I don't know if there's no silver bullet answer. Can I just say that from the pulpit? There's no silver bullet answer in suffering. There's none. You don't have one in Scripture. Do you realize that Job, after 37 chapters of suffering, the last 4 or 5 chapters where God addressed him, God never gave him the reason why? That's significant. That is so significant because it is not the why this happened that brings a person to resolve what they are going through with who God is. Instead, it is seeing God more clearly, because the answer in 5 chapters that God gave to Job was a more clear and detailed definition of who he is and who Job is not. The answer is in the who, it is not in the why. The why will not soothe the pain that people go through, but the who will. And in time, it's the who, the God, that capital W who. God is the one who can bring sense, so to speak, to a soul, even if you can't articulate it. How many people, here's the thing, suffering is the test for us on whether we really believe God is just and right and good and fair. Do you know that in Job, Job's righteousness and his actual faith was shown in the midst of his suffering? It was his real faith. Yes, it was shown in the sacrifices every morning that he would offer on his children's behalf in case they maybe had sinned against God and he was offering an atoning sin sacrifice for them. Yes, his faith was shown in that. His faith was shown in his righteous conduct that was famous throughout the whole land. Yes, his faith was seen in that, but his faith was seen in the suffering when it says of him, recorded for all of eternity, and in his suffering, Job did not charge God with wrongdoing. That's his faith. Though you slay me, the psalmist says, I will yet praise you. I will yet praise you, because you are sovereign, God. Whatever comes our way, whatever comes our way. And let us remember too, okay, here's the ditch in this thinking. Let me just offer a caution. Underlying the question oftentimes, how can God be good and all-powerful and allow evil and suffering in the world, okay? Underlying that question is an assumption that I'm good and I wouldn't allow those things to happen in this world. Do you see the fault of that assumption? I'm good. And in my scope of wisdom and in my scope of what is right and just and fair, I would never allow things to happen that are evil. I would never allow things to happen that cause people to suffer. Are we good? Are we good? No. Let me bring that point home even more. Underlying the question is an assumption that I am good and God is not, and I know more and better than God. That in the command of his universe, God somehow is failing. And were I in the cockpit, God, I would do it so much better. And also underlying the assumption is somehow that suffering in this world, in my personal life, loss and grief and pain and hurt, somehow God does not use in the larger picture for the good in my life. God uses things to build and to strengthen. There's not one person who has ever lost and who has ever suffered who, going through that storm and finding a closer intimacy with God on the other side, who wouldn't say, I would not choose to go through that and I would not go through it again, but God has so taught me things. And he is so using me now through what I have gone through in the lives of other people who are hurting. If one thing we could say, human suffering and evil at least draws out in us something that connects us and draws us closer to each other. Draws out maybe the best in us towards others when we see hurting and suffering. You know what else it ought to be teaching us? We ought not to expect what God has promised in the future until it gets here. There is perfection that is coming. This world is an absolute disaster. It's under the control of a sovereign God, and it's moving towards the ends that he promises. But understand that God has promised something beyond this. It's not just random disaster, chaos, and catastrophe, and suffering, and evil, and all of that, and then it just ends, and then it disappears into nothing afterwards, and there's no existence. God has promised that there is a day of judgment when all wrong will be made right, when all evil will be paid back, when all good will be rewarded, and when God will bring in the perfect, and he will bring in his kingdom, and it will be established forever and ever. That's what the Bible promises. Then, not now. So here's the question. Do we believe and see that that is what's coming, and that God is just and sovereign, and he will make a just and sovereign judgment in the days that he has appointed for himself to do so? We're not in control of this world. We're not in control of it. But do I have faith that God is in control of it, and that what he has said will come will actually come? Let's pray. Father in heaven, if the tears that mankind has shed could be counted, you would know the number. More than the sand on the seashore, and more than the stars in the sky are the number of tears that have come. And Lord, in this world, it is hard to make sense of why. And we may not understand. And we don't understand oftentimes. With Job, we sit broken, bald, torn clothes, in the ash heap and the garbage outside of the city, weeping until we have no more tears to cry, and asking why. And God, through this life, there will be the light and the darkness, and there will be the joys and the sorrows. And you are sovereign over them all. You are the one who gives life and takes it away. You are the one who brings honor and dishonor. You are the one who wounds and heals. You are the sovereign God. And today, Lord, may our hearts submit to you. God, may we know that you and you alone are sovereign, and call upon you, Lord. Praise you, that we may praise you with Job, knowing that naked we come from our mother's womb into this life, and very well could be naked that we leave this life. Nothing comes to pass, God, that you do not know about and have not ordered according to your plans. And not only do we know that you are in control, but that, God, you are good and righteous and just, and you will bring justice, and all that you have promised will come to pass. Our faith declares that today, and we worship you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let's stand to sing in closing.
In the morning, when I rise, in the morning, when I rise, in the morning, when I rise, give me Jesus, give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. You can have all this world. Just give me Jesus. When I am alone, oh, when I am alone, oh, when I am alone, give me Jesus, give me Jesus, give me Jesus. You can have all this world. Give me Jesus. When I come to die, oh, when I come to die, oh, when I come to die, give me Jesus, give me Jesus, give me Jesus, me, Jesus.
May the Lord make your love increase and overflow for each other and for everyone else, just as ours does for you. And may Christ Jesus strengthen your hearts so that you will be blameless and holy in the presence of our God and Father when He, our Lord Jesus, comes with all His holy ones. Amen.
Amen.